Hey, lady, you lost? This is a military facility, not a senior center. Petty Officer Ryan Morrison's voice cut through the afternoon chatter of the Naval Special Warfare Command mess hall like a rusty blade. The muscle-bound SEALs stood with three teammates, their tan uniforms pristine, chests decorated with ribbons and the coveted trident pin that marked them as America's maritime elite. Their target sat alone at table 7, a small woman with silver-streaked brown hair, wearing a navy cardigan and reading glasses, a clipboard of documents spread before her untouched tray of food. At 62, Kaylin Mitchell looked more like someone's grandmother than anything that belonged in the heart of SEAL country. Her presence among the testosterone-fueled warriors seemed as out of place as a flower in a minefield. Morrison smirked at his buddies, feeding off their encouraging chuckles. "Ma'am, I think you wandered into the wrong building. The family waiting area is in the admin building, about half a mile that way." He pointed toward the door with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life. The woman didn't look up from her paperwork. She simply reached for her coffee cup with a steady hand, took a measured sip, and continued reading. The calculated indifference in her response was like throwing gasoline on Morrison's ego. But in the next 20 minutes, everything they thought they knew about protocol, respect, and chain of command would crumble into dust. Morrison stepped closer, his 6'4" frame casting a shadow over the small table. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification. This is a restricted facility." His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant compliance from both enemies and allies alike. Kaylin Mitchell finally looked up. Her hazel eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, assessed Morrison with the clinical precision of someone evaluating a specimen. She reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a laminated badge, setting it on the table without a word. Morrison leaned forward, squinting at the credentials. The official Department of Defense seal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the title beneath it made his confident smirk falter slightly. "Psychological Evaluation, Contractor," he read aloud, his voice losing some of its swagger. Petty Officer Jake Williams, Morrison's right-hand man, laughed nervously from behind his leader's shoulder. "Holy cow, Tank! Looks like somebody called in the head doctor." His attempt at humor fell flat in the suddenly tense atmosphere. The mess hall, which normally buzzed with the conversations of 60-plus personnel during the lunch rush, began to develop pockets of unusual quiet. Sailors at nearby tables started glancing over, sensing the shift in dynamics. This wasn't just another case of military bravado. Something was different about this encounter. Petty Officer Alex Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, moved to flank Kaylin's other side. His technical mind immediately focused on the operational implications. "Ma'am, what exactly are you evaluating here?" His question carried an edge of suspicion that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. Kaylin's response was to lift her clipboard slightly, revealing a thick stack of official documents bearing multiple classification stamps. The papers were angled just enough that the SEALs could see official letterhead and redacted sections, but not enough to read specific content. Her movements were economical, professional, and entirely too calm for someone being intimidated by 4 of America's most elite warriors. Petty Officer Danny Murphy, the youngest of the group at 26, shifted uncomfortably. "Tank, maybe we should just let the lady do her job," he suggested, his voice betraying the first hints of uncertainty. Morrison's jaw tightened. He'd built his reputation on decisive action and unwavering confidence. Backing down now, in front of his team and half the mess hall, wasn't an option. "Ma'am, I don't care what that badge says. You're in our house now, and I need to understand what you're doing here." The intervention came from an unexpected source. Seaman Lopez, working the serving line, had been watching the confrontation develop with growing unease. At 19, he still possessed the idealistic notions about military honor that hadn't yet been worn down by the realities of institutional politics. Something about the way the woman held herself, the deliberate precision of her movements, reminded him of his drill instructors back in basic training. If this kind of disrespect toward our elders makes your blood boil, hit that like button and subscribe to Warrior Stories. Military heroes deserve better treatment than this. Lopez caught the eye of Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, a more experienced sailor who had been observing from across the room. Martinez had 22 years of service under his belt and had developed an instinct for recognizing trouble before it escalated beyond control. He'd noticed the woman's posture the moment she'd entered the facility, the way she'd surveyed the room with tactical awareness before selecting her seat. The contractor's position at table 7 wasn't random. It provided clear sightlines to all entrances, positioned her back to a solid wall, and offered multiple egress routes. These weren't the choices of a confused civilian who'd wandered into the wrong building. This was someone with serious training making deliberate tactical decisions. Master Chief Kellaway, stationed near the coffee counter, had been conducting his own quiet observation. At 48, he'd reached his position through a combination of technical expertise, leadership ability, and an almost supernatural capacity for reading people and situations. The interaction between Morrison's team and the contractor was setting off every alarm bell in his experienced mind. The woman's credentials looked legitimate, but more importantly, her behavior patterns matched those of someone operating under official authority. The way she'd positioned her documents, the deliberate revelation of her ID, even her choice to remain seated, despite Morrison's obvious intimidation attempts, all suggested someone who knew exactly where she stood in the chain of command. Morrison leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table in a clear invasion of personal space. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of evaluation you think you're conducting, but this is Team 6 territory. We don't answer to civilian contractors, especially ones who show up unannounced and start taking notes." Williams stepped closer, emboldened by his leader's aggressive stance. "Maybe you should pack up your little clipboard and find somewhere else to conduct your business," he added, his voice carrying an implied threat. For the first time since the confrontation began, Kaylin Mitchell's expression shifted slightly. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, the kind of expression worn by someone who'd just been dealt a winning hand, but wasn't ready to reveal it yet. She set down her pen with deliberate precision, the small click audible in the relative quiet that had settled over their section of the mess hall. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to command attention despite its soft volume, "I appreciate your concern for operational security. It demonstrates the kind of vigilance that's essential for effective special operations." Her words carried a subtle acknowledgement of their elite status, but there was something else beneath the diplomatic language. Rodriguez, whose job required him to analyze communication patterns and extract meaning from encrypted transmissions, caught the undertone immediately. This wasn't the nervous deference of a civilian trying to avoid conflict. This was someone speaking from a position of confidence. "Ma'am," Morrison pressed, his patience wearing thin, "I'm going to need you to explain exactly what authority you're operating under and who authorized your presence in this facility." Kaylin reached for her coffee cup again, taking another measured sip before responding. Her movements remained unhurried, professional, and entirely too composed for someone facing interrogation by 4 hostile special operations personnel. "The classification level of my current assignment precludes me from discussing specific operational details," she replied. "However, I can assure you that my presence here has been properly authorized through appropriate channels." Murphy exchanged glances with Rodriguez. The contractor's language patterns were shifting into something that sounded increasingly familiar. Her use of terms like classification level and operational details weren't the vocabulary choices of a typical civilian consultant. These were phrases used by people with serious security clearances and military experience. The revelation hit Rodriguez first. His technical background had taught SRs to analyze data patterns and identify anomalies. The woman's posture, her vocabulary, her tactical positioning, even the way she'd organized her paperwork, all followed patterns consistent with military training. But not just any military training. These were the habits of someone with special operations experience. Williams, growing frustrated with the contractor's calm responses, decided to escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This facility doesn't receive unscheduled civilian visitors. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your materials and accompany us to the Master-at-Arms office for verification of your credentials." The statement represented a clear escalation from verbal intimidation to threatened physical action. Several nearby sailors stopped at their conversations entirely, sensing that the situation was approaching a point of no return. The legal and procedural implications of forcibly removing a credentialed contractor were significant, but Williams seemed prepared to accept those risks rather than lose face. Kaylin's response was to reach for her documents and organize them into a neat stack. For a moment, it appeared she might comply with Williams's demand. Then she looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his directly. "Petty Officer Williams," she said, her voice carrying a new edge, "before we proceed down that path, perhaps you should consider whether your current course of action aligns with the operational standards expected of SEAL Team 6 personnel. The use of Williams's rank and the specific identification of their unit affiliation sent a chill through the group. This wasn't publicly available information. Knowing someone's rank could be explained by reading name tags, but identifying specific unit assignments required access to classified personnel data. Morrison felt his confidence waver for the first time since the confrontation began. "How do you know Williams's rank?" he demanded. "And how do you know our unit designation?" Instead of answering directly, Kaylin lifted her pen and made a brief notation on the top document in her stack. The movement was casual, almost dismissive, but it carried clear implications. Whatever evaluation she was conducting, their behavior was being documented in real time. "Did you catch that detail? Drop a comment if you've ever been underestimated because of your appearance." Rodriguez stepped back slightly, his analytical mind working through the tactical implications of their situation. If the contractor had legitimate access to classified personnel information, then her presence in the facility was almost certainly authorized at a level well above their security clearance. Continuing to challenge her authority could result in serious consequences for their careers and their team's operational status. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "perhaps we could contact your supervising authority to verify the scope of your evaluation. I'm sure there's been some miscommunication about notification protocols." Kaylin's smile widened slightly. "That's a very reasonable suggestion, Petty Officer Rodriguez. However, the nature of my evaluation specifically requires observing natural team dynamics without prior notification to the subjects. Advance warning would compromise the validity of the assessment data." The word subjects hit the four SEALs like a physical blow. They weren't dealing with a confused civilian or even an unwelcome visitor. They were the targets of an official evaluation, and their behavior over the past 15 minutes had been recorded and analyzed by someone with the authority to affect their careers and their team's mission assignments. Murphy's face had gone pale. "Tank," he whispered urgently, "I think we need to step back and reassess this situation." But Morrison's pride and public positioning made retreat impossible. Too many people were watching. Too many witnesses to his authority being challenged by a small elderly woman with a clipboard. The cost of backing down now seemed higher than the risk of continuing to press forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous tone, "I don't care what kind of evaluation you think you're conducting. This is my team, and I don't answer to civilian oversight. If you want to observe SEAL operations, you need to go through proper channels and get proper authorization." The statement represented Morrison's final line in the sand. He was essentially challenging not just Kaylin's authority, but the entire civilian oversight structure that governed special operations activities. It was a position that demonstrated either remarkable courage or catastrophic judgment. Kaylin set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said quietly, "your understanding of proper channels and authorization procedures appears to need some updating. Perhaps this conversation would benefit from the presence of your commanding officer." The suggestion carried the weight of an ultimatum. Either Morrison could de-escalate the situation voluntarily, or she would escalate it through official channels that would almost certainly result in consequences for his team. Williams moved closer to Morrison's shoulder. "Tank, maybe she's right. Maybe we should get the Master Chief involved before this goes any further." The mention of Master Chief Kellaway reminded Morrison that they weren't operating in a vacuum. Their confrontation with the contractor was being observed by senior enlisted personnel who had both the authority and the responsibility to intervene if the situation threatened good order and discipline. From across the room, Kellaway had indeed been monitoring the developing situation with growing concern. His experience had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and situations driven by ego and testosterone. Morrison's team appeared to be crossing into dangerous territory, challenging someone who might have the authority to end their careers. The Master Chief began moving slowly toward Table 7, his path casual but deliberate. He needed to position himself to intervene quickly if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. But he also wanted to gather more information about the contractor's actual authority and mission before committing to any particular course of action. Morrison noticed Kellaway's movement and recognized the implications. The presence of senior enlisted oversight would force him to justify his actions through official channels rather than relying on personal authority and intimidation. It was exactly the kind of scrutiny he wanted to avoid. "Ma'am," Morrison said, making one final attempt to maintain control of the situation, I'm going to give you one last opportunity to explain your presence here and provide proper documentation of your authority. If you can't do that, then you're going to have to leave the premises." Kaylin reached for her document stack and lifted the top page slightly, revealing enough of the content to show multiple official seals and classification markings. The brief glimpse suggested authorization levels that were well above Morrison's security clearance and access requirements. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of professional formality, "the scope of my evaluation encompasses team leadership, decision-making under pressure, and adherence to established protocols when interacting with authorized personnel. Your performance in all three areas has been noted and will be included in my final assessment." The revelation that their confrontation was itself part of the evaluation created a new level of crisis for Morrison's team. Every word they'd spoken, every action they'd taken, had been analyzed and documented by someone with the authority to affect their operational future. Rodriguez grabbed Morrison's arm. "Tank, we need to stop this now. If she's conducting an official evaluation, then everything we've done here is going to be reviewed by command." But Morrison's pride had passed the point of rational calculation. He'd committed too much of his reputation and authority to back down without losing face in front of his team and the entire mess hall. "Lady," Morrison snarled, "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this ends now." He reached for Kaylin's wrist, intending to force her to her feet and escort her from the facility. The physical contact represented the crossing of a legal and procedural line that transformed the confrontation from a dispute over authority into an assault on a credentialed federal contractor. It was exactly the kind of action that would de-trigger immediate intervention from senior command and potentially result in criminal charges. Kaylin's response was swift and professional. Her free hand moved to Morrison's wrist, applying pressure to a specific nerve point that caused immediate and intense pain without visible injury. The technique was precise, controlled, and unmistakably the product of advanced combat training. Morrison dropped to one knee, his face contorted in shock and pain. The sudden reversal of the power dynamic sent a ripple of stunned silence through the observing crowd. The hulking SEAL who had been dominating the confrontation was now on the ground, controlled by a 62-year-old woman using techniques that most of the witnesses couldn't even identify. "Holy cow," Williams breathed, his voice barely audible over the sudden quiet that had settled over the mess hall. Kaylin maintained pressure on the nerve point for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, but not long enough to cause lasting damage. Then she released Morrison's wrist and calmly returned her hand to her document stack. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "physical assault on federal contractors conducting authorized evaluations is a serious violation of both military and civilian law. I trust this was simply an error in judgment rather than deliberate criminal behavior." Morrison struggled back to his feet, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. The technique she'd used had been fast, precise, and completely invisible to most observers. Anyone watching from a distance would have seen him suddenly drop to his knees without any clear understanding of why. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quickly, stepping between Morrison and Kaylin, I apologize for my teammates' actions. We clearly misunderstood the nature of your presence here." Kaylin made another notation on her evaluation form. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's assault and Rodriguez's attempt at damage control were both being documented for official review. The confrontation had reached a tipping point where senior intervention was not just likely, but inevitable. Master Chief Kellaway accelerated his approach to Table 7, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond the scope of peer correction and into the realm of official disciplinary action. From the serving line, Seaman Lopez watched the developing crisis with growing alarm. His instincts told him that the 4 SEALs had made a catastrophic error in judgment, challenging someone who possessed both the authority and the capability to destroy their careers. The woman's combat technique had been professional, measured, and entirely too sophisticated for a civilian contractor without serious military background. The precision of her nerve point application suggested special operations training at the highest levels. Williams and Murphy exchanged panicked glances. The realization that they had been party to the assault of a federal contractor was beginning to sink in, along with the potential consequences for their careers and their team's operational status. "Ma'am," Williams said desperately, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Perhaps we could start over and approach this situation more appropriately. Kaylin looked up from her paperwork, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying a new edge of professional assessment. Petty Officer Williams, the purpose of this evaluation is to observe authentic behavior patterns under stress. Starting over would compromise the validity of the assessment data. The statement confirmed their worst fears. The entire confrontation had been an evaluation exercise, and their performance had been an unmitigated disaster. Every moment of disrespect, every escalation of aggression, every failure to follow proper protocols had been documented by someone with direct access to their command structure. Murphy stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, what exactly will be included in your evaluation report?" Kaylin's smile returned, but it was no longer the expression of someone holding back information. It was the look of someone who had gathered all the data required and was preparing to render judgment. "Petty Officer Murphy," she said, her voice carrying across the silent mess hall, "evaluation reports are submitted directly to operational commanders for review and action. The specific content and recommendations are classified above your current access level. The implications hit all 4 SEALs simultaneously. Their behavior during the confrontation would be reviewed by officers with the authority to affect their security clearances, their operational assignments, and their continued service with SEAL Team 6. Morrison, still nursing his injured wrist, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, perhaps we could discuss this privately and reach some kind of understanding about the events here today." The suggestion bordered on attempting to influence a federal evaluation through unofficial channels, another serious violation that could result in additional criminal charges. Kaylin's expression hardened as she recognized the implications of Morrison's proposal. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "any attempt to influence or interfere with official evaluation procedures constitutes obstruction of federal oversight activities. I strongly advise you to limit your further comments to those directly relevant to operational matters." The warning was clear and final. Any additional attempts to challenge her authority or influence her evaluation would result in additional charges that could end their military careers entirely. Rodriguez, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond salvage, made the decision to cut losses and attempt damage control. "Ma'am, we apologize for any inconvenience our actions may have caused. We'll return to our duties and allow you to complete your evaluation without further interference." It was a complete surrender, an acknowledgement that Kaylin possessed the authority they had been challenging and that their resistance had been both futile and professionally destructive. Kaylin made a final notation on her evaluation form, her pen strokes deliberate and final. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had just completed a successful mission, "thank you for your cooperation. Your natural responses have provided valuable data for my assessment." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. The evaluation was complete, and their participation was no longer required. 4 of America's most elite warriors had been professionally and definitively outmaneuvered by a small woman with silver hair and a clipboard. Master Chief Kellaway reached Table 7 just as the 4 SEALs began to disperse, their movements awkward and uncertain. The dynamics of the confrontation had shifted so dramatically that they were no longer sure of their status or their appropriate response to the situation. "Ma'am," Kellaway said, his voice respectful but cautious, "I'm Master Chief Kellaway. I apologize if there have been any procedural irregularities regarding your visit to our facility." Kaylin looked up at the senior enlisted man, her assessment extending to include his professional demeanor and approach to the situation. "Master Chief," she replied, "your concern for proper protocols is noted and appreciated. However, my evaluation specifically required observing unmodified behavioral patterns, so prior notification would have compromised the validity of the assessment data." Kellaway nodded, his experienced mind working through the implications of her statement. An evaluation that required observing natural behavior meant that command structure above his level had authorized surveillance of his personnel without his knowledge. That suggested serious concerns about operational readiness or team performance. "Ma'am, if I may ask," Kellaway said carefully, "will your evaluation include recommendations regarding facility procedures or personnel management protocols?" The question reflected his professional concern for his responsibility as senior enlisted advisor. If the contractor's evaluation identified systematic problems with his oversight or management, The consequences could extend beyond the Four Seals to include his own career and reputation. Kaylin gathered her documents into a neat stack, her movements signaling the conclusion of her immediate evaluation activities. "Master Chief," she said, "evaluation reports are submitted directly to operational commanders for review and distribution. The specific scope and recommendations will be determined by command authority above facility level." The response confirmed Kellaway's suspicions about the evaluation's high-level authorization and significant potential consequences. Someone with serious authority had ordered assessment of SEAL Team 6 performance, and the results would be reviewed at levels where career-ending decisions were made routinely. The mess hall remained unusually quiet, with most personnel aware that they had witnessed something significant but uncertain about the appropriate response. The confrontation between the contractor and Morrison's team had been resolved, but the implications were still unfolding. From their positions near the serving line, several junior sailors watched as the Four Seals slowly made their way toward the exit. The body language of America's maritime elite had been transformed from confident swagger to uncertain retreat in the space of 20 minutes. Seaman Lopez, who had observed the entire confrontation, found himself reassessing everything he thought he understood about military hierarchy and authority. The small woman with the clipboard had demonstrated capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of civilian contractor roles and responsibilities. The revelation that ongoing evaluation activities could be conducted without notification to facility personnel raised questions about oversight and accountability that extended beyond the immediate confrontation. How many other activities were being assessed without their knowledge? Who else possessed evaluation authority that superseded normal command channels? Kaylin completed her document organization and returned her materials to a leather portfolio. Her movements remained professional and unhurried, suggesting someone comfortable with high-pressure situations and accustomed to working under hostile observation. "Master Chief," she said, addressing Kellaway directly, "I appreciate your facility's cooperation with this evaluation exercise. Your personnel's natural responses have provided valuable assessment data that will contribute to operational readiness improvements." The statement suggested that the evaluation had been successful from her perspective, gathering the behavioral data required for whatever analysis her superiors had requested. But it also implied that improvements were needed, that current performance levels were somehow inadequate for operational requirements. Kellaway nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, if there's anything else our facility can provide to support your evaluation activities, please let me know." The offer was both professional courtesy and practical necessity. Maintaining positive relationships with evaluation personnel could influence the tone and recommendations of their final reports, potentially mitigating negative consequences for facility personnel and operations. Kaylin stood slowly, gathering her portfolio and coffee cup with deliberate precision. Her movements remained economical and professional, but there was something else now, a sense of mission completion and preparation for transition to the next phase of her activities. "Master Chief," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "my immediate evaluation objectives have been completed successfully. However, there may be follow-up activities depending on command review of the initial assessment data. The possibility of additional evaluation phases created new uncertainty for facility personnel. If the initial assessment had identified serious problems, subsequent activities might include more intensive oversight and potential personnel actions." From across the room, Morrison's team had gathered near the exit, their conversation hushed but intense. The realization that their confrontation with the contractor would be reviewed by senior command was beginning to sink in, along with the potential consequences for their careers and operational assignments. Rodriguez was conducting damage assessment, trying to determine the scope of their exposure and potential mitigation strategies. The contractor's demonstration of combat capabilities suggested military background at a level that commanded serious respect from operational commanders. Williams and Murphy were focused on the immediate practical implications. If their evaluation included recommendations for personnel actions, they might face reassignment, loss of security clearance, or even discharge from military service. Morrison remained largely silent, nursing his injured wrist and his wounded pride. The physical demonstration of the contractor's capabilities had been a humbling experience that challenged his fundamental assumptions about civilian authority and special operations hierarchy. The four SEALs finally departed the mess hall, their exit marking the end of the immediate confrontation, but not the resolution of its consequences. Their evaluation data would be analyzed, reported, and reviewed by officers with the authority to determine their professional futures. Kaylin remained at Table 7, completing final documentation and preparing for departure. Her evaluation activities appeared to be concluding, but the implications of her assessment would continue to unfold through official channels for days or weeks to come. The mess hall began to return to normal activity levels, but the undercurrent of tension and uncertainty remained. Personnel who had witnessed the confrontation understood that they had observed something significant, a demonstration of authority and capability that challenged conventional understanding of military hierarchy. Speaking of financial security, active duty personnel often overlook comprehensive life insurance options. SGLI provides basic coverage, but civilian contractors like Kaylin need robust private policies for their specialized high-risk consulting work. Master Chief Kellaway remained near Table 7, his presence both protective and supervisory. His experience had taught him to recognize situations with potential for broader implications, and the contractor's evaluation clearly fell into that category. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "will there be notification procedures for follow-up evaluation activities? I want to ensure proper facility support and coordination." Kaylin's response was measured and professional. "Master Chief, notification protocols will be determined by operational commanders based on assessment findings and command priorities. Facility leadership will receive appropriate briefings through established channels." The response suggested that decision-making authority resided well above facility level, that the evaluation was part of larger operational assessment activities that extended beyond local command responsibility. As Kaylin prepared to depart Table 7, her movements attracted attention from personnel throughout the mess hall. The small woman who had professionally neutralized 4 elite SEALs was preparing to leave, taking with her evaluation data that could reshape careers and operational assignments. Her portfolio contained documentation that would influence decisions made at levels where individual personnel were statistics rather than people, where operational readiness took precedence over personal considerations or unit loyalty. The confrontation that had begun with casual disrespect and escalated to physical assault had revealed capabilities and authority that existed outside conventional military hierarchy. The contractor possessed both the training to defend herself against special operations personnel and the official authority to evaluate their performance and recommend consequences. As she stood to leave, Kaylin's final glance around the mess hall was that of someone completing a successful intelligence-gathering operation. She had obtained the behavioral data required, documented performance failures, and identified areas requiring command attention and possible intervention. The evaluation exercise had been designed to test Team 6 performance under stress, and the results had clearly fallen short of acceptable standards. Their failure to recognize legitimate authority, their resort to intimidation and physical force, and their inability to adapt when confronted with superior capability all pointed to serious deficiencies in leadership and judgment. But as Kaylin gathered her materials and prepared to deliver her assessment to command authority, none of the facility personnel could have imagined the true scope of her background and the devastating implications of their failures. The quiet woman with silver hair and a clipboard was about to reveal capabilities and authority that would transform their understanding of civilian oversight and special operations hierarchy. The real revelation was yet to come. Kaylin Mitchell gathered her leather portfolio and stood with deliberate precision, her movements signaling the completion of her immediate evaluation objectives. The mess hall maintained its unusual quiet, personnel throughout the facility still processing the implications of what they had witnessed. 4 elite SEAL Team 6 operatives had been professionally neutralized by a 62-year-old contractor who appeared to possess capabilities far beyond her official designation. Master Chief Kellaway remained positioned nearer Table 7, his experienced instincts telling him that the situation was far from resolved. The contractor's demonstration of advanced combat techniques and her obvious familiarity with classified operational procedures suggested background and authority that extended well beyond standard civilian oversight activities. As Kaylin approached the main exit, her path took her directly past the table where Morrison's remaining teammates had regrouped. Rodriguez, Williams, and Murphy watched her approach with expressions combining respect, uncertainty, and barely concealed dread about the consequences of their earlier confrontation. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly as she passed, his voice carrying genuine contrition. "We apologize for any misunderstanding regarding your evaluation activities." Kaylin paused, her hazel eyes assessing the three SEALs with clinical precision. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," she replied, her tone professional but not unkind. "Authentic behavioral responses under stress provide the most valuable assessment data. Your team's natural reactions have been thoroughly documented." The statement carried dual implications. Their apology was noted and appreciated, but their earlier behavior had already been recorded and would be included in whatever evaluation report reached their commanding officers. Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ma'am, if I may ask, how extensive will the evaluation report be regarding today's activities?" The question reflected the team's growing awareness that their careers might hang in the balance based on 20 minutes of poor judgment and escalating aggression towards someone they had fundamentally misjudged. Kaylin's response was measured and professional. "Petty Officer Williams, evaluation reports include comprehensive behavioral analysis, decision-making assessment, and recommendations for operational readiness improvement. The specific scope and detail level are determined by command requirements and classification protocols." Murphy leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, will there be opportunities for our team to provide context or clarification regarding the events here today?" It was a desperate question, reflecting hope that somehow they might mitigate the damage through additional explanation or demonstration of their actual capabilities under normal circumstances. Kaylin's expression remained neutral. "Petty Officer Murphy, evaluation protocols include comprehensive analysis of all relevant factors. Command review will consider operational context, stress variables, and establish performance benchmarks in reaching final assessments." The response was diplomatically non-committal, but offered no real reassurance. Their fate would be determined by officers who reviewed evaluation data without personal knowledge of their individual circumstances or previous performance history. As Kaylin resumed her movement toward the exit, her departure was interrupted by the sudden opening of the main doors. Captain Barnes, the base commander, strode into the mess hall with an expression of controlled urgency that immediately commanded attention throughout the facility. Captain Barnes was a decorated officer with 26 years of naval service, including multiple combat deployments and extensive experience managing special operations personnel. His unexpected appearance during routine lunch hours suggested that significant command-level activities were underway. Behind Captain Barnes came Commander Hayes, the SEAL Team's 6th commanding officer, whose presence elevated the situation to an entirely new level of command attention. Hayes was a legendary operator whose career included some of the most classified and dangerous missions in recent naval special warfare history. The entrance of two senior officers during what should have been a routine evaluation conclusion created immediate tension throughout the mess hall. Personnel began standing and assuming positions of attention as military protocol required when senior officers entered operational spaces. Kaylin Mitchell paused near the exit, her expression shifting to one of professional alertness. The arrival of base and unit commanders suggested that her evaluation activities had triggered command-level response, possibly indicating that preliminary assessment data had already been transmitted and reviewed. Captain Barnes surveyed the mess hall quickly before his attention focused on Kaylin. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I need to speak with you immediately regarding your evaluation activities." The statement confirmed that command-level review of evaluation data was already underway, that preliminary findings had reached decision-makers with authority to take immediate action based on assessment results. Commander Hayes moved to flank Captain Barnes, his attention shifting between Kaylin and the location where Morrison's team had been gathered. His expression suggested familiarity with both the evaluation protocols and the potential implications of whatever findings had triggered this command intervention. Kaylin approached the two officers with professional composure, her movements indicating someone comfortable operating at senior command levels. "Captain Barnes, Commander Hayes," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority, "I assume you've received preliminary assessment data through appropriate channels." Captain Barnes nodded grimly. "Ma'am, we need to discuss the scope and implications of your findings immediately. This situation has command attention at levels that extend well beyond facility management." The statement suggested that evaluation results had reached senior leadership with authority to make decisions affecting personnel, operations, and potentially unit assignments or mission responsibilities. Commander Hayes stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to understand the specific behavioral patterns and performance deficiencies identified during your assessment activities." His question reflected command-level concern about SEAL Team 6 operational readiness and the potential need for immediate corrective action based on evaluation findings. Kalen's response was measured and professional. "Commander, detailed assessment findings are documented and classified according to established protocols. However, I can confirm that significant deficiencies were observed in areas including authority recognition, stress response, and adherence to established procedures when interacting with authorized oversight personnel." The summary hit like a physical blow to the observing SEALs. Their confrontation with the contractor was being characterized as failures in fundamental operational competencies, deficiencies that could affect their security clearances and operational assignments. Captain Barnes exchanged glances with Commander Hayes before addressing Kalen directly. "Ma'am, based on your preliminary assessment, what are your immediate recommendations regarding Team 6 operational status?" The question carried enormous implications. If the contractor recommended suspension of operational activities pending corrective action, the team could be grounded indefinitely while command reviewed their performance and implemented training or disciplinary measures. Kalen considered her response carefully. "Captain, formal recommendations will be included in my comprehensive evaluation report. However, I can confirm that observed deficiencies raise questions about current operational readiness levels and may require command review of deployment schedules and mission assignments." Rodriguez, Williams, and Murphy exchanged panicked glances from their position across the room. The contractor was essentially recommending that their team be removed from operational status pending further evaluation and possible remedial training. Commander Hayes' expression darkened as the implications became clear. "Ma'am, I need to understand the specific scope of authority under which you're conducting these evaluations. This appears to involve oversight responsibilities that extend beyond standard contractor activities." The question reflected growing command-level concern about the evaluation's authorization and the potential implications of its findings for unit operations and personnel management. Kalen reached into her portfolio and extracted a document bearing multiple official seals and classification markings. "Commander," she said, handing him the authorization paperwork, "my evaluation activities are conducted under direct authority from Naval Special Warfare Command, with oversight responsibility, extending to operational readiness assessment and personnel performance review." Commander Hayes examined the documentation, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching shock as he recognized the scope of authority represented by the official seals and classification levels. Captain Barnes read over Hayes' shoulder, his face pale as he processed the implications of the authorization documentation. "Holy cow," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "This is authorized at flag officer level." The revelation that Kalen's evaluation activities had been authorized by admiral-level authority transformed the entire situation. This wasn't routine contractor oversight or standard performance assessment. This was high-level command evaluation of special operations readiness with potential implications for unit structure and mission capabilities. Master Chief Kellaway, who had been observing from a respectful distance, stepped forward. "Captain, if I may ask, what does this mean for facility operations and personnel assignments?" His question reflected practical concern about the immediate implications for the sailors and officers under his supervision, particularly those who had been involved in the confrontation with the contractor. Captain Barnes handed the authorization documentation back to Kalen with obvious reluctance. "Master Chief," he said, his voice carrying new gravity, "this evaluation was authorized as part of comprehensive special operations readiness assessment. The findings will be reviewed at Naval Special Warfare Command level, with potential implications for operational assignments and unit structure." The scope of the evaluation's authority was becoming clear to facility personnel. This wasn't isolated assessment of individual performance. This was systematic review of special operations capabilities with potential consequences extending throughout the command structure. Commander Hayes addressed Kalen directly. "Ma'am, I need to understand whether your evaluation activities include assessment of command oversight and facility management procedures." The question reflected his concern that evaluation findings might extend beyond individual personnel to include criticism of his leadership and unit management practices. Kalen's response was diplomatically professional. Commander, evaluation protocols include comprehensive assessment of all factors affecting operational readiness. Command oversight, facility procedures, and personnel management practices are all relevant to overall unit effectiveness and mission capability. The implication was clear. Not only had Morrison's team failed their evaluation, but questions were being raised about the command climate and management practices that had allowed such behavior to develop among elite personnel. From across the mess hall, Morrison finally returned from whatever location he had retreated to nurse his wounded pride and injured wrist. His arrival at the moment of maximum command, attention, and evaluation revelation created additional drama for the unfolding situation. Morrison's expression shifted from residual anger to growing horror as he recognized the presence of Captain Barnes and Commander Hayes in what should have been routine evaluation conclusion. The arrival of senior command suggested that his confrontation with the contractor had triggered consequences extending far beyond his initial expectations. Captain Barnes noticed Morrison's entrance and gestured for him to approach. "Petty Officer Morrison," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, "you need to join this conversation immediately." Morrison approached with obvious reluctance, his body language reflecting awareness that his career was likely hanging in the balance based on decisions being made in real time by officers with authority to end his military service. Commander Hayes addressed Morrison directly. "Petty Officer, I understand you had a physical confrontation with our contractor during her evaluation activities." The statement was presented as established fact rather than allegation, suggesting that detailed information about the incident had already been transmitted to command level and accepted as accurate. Morrison's response was carefully measured. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding regarding the contractor's authority and purpose for being in the facility. When I attempted to escort her to the Master-at-Arms office for credential verification, she responded with what appeared to be defensive techniques. It was a careful reframing of events that minimized his aggressive behavior and characterized Kalen's response as potentially excessive rather than professionally appropriate." Kalen's expression shifted slightly, her professional demeanor taking on an edge that suggested Morrison's characterization of events was both inaccurate and inappropriate. "Commander Hayes," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "Petty Officer Morrison's account omits several relevant details, including his initial dismissive comments, his unauthorized demand for identification, his threat of forced removal from the premises, and his decision to initiate unwanted physical contact despite clear verbal warnings." The systematic correction of Morrison's narrative demonstrated both Kalen's detailed documentation of events and her confidence in challenging his version when presented to senior command. Captain Barnes turned to Morrison with an expression of controlled anger. "Petty Officer, are you suggesting that your physical contact with a federal contractor conducting authorized evaluation activities was justified by security concerns?" The question was essentially a trap. Any answer that justified his behavior would acknowledge that he had assaulted someone with legitimate authority to be present, while any admission of error would confirm serious violations of military law and regulations. Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the impossible position his earlier actions had created. "Sir, I may have misinterpreted the situation and used poor judgment in my response to what I perceived as a security concern." The admission was carefully worded to minimize culpability while acknowledging error, but it fell far short of taking full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. Commander Hayes exchanged glances with Captain Barnes before addressing the assembled personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall, "what occurred here today represents a serious failure in recognizing legitimate authority and following established protocols when dealing with authorized oversight personnel." The statement confirmed that command-level review had concluded Morrison's team had acted inappropriately and that consequences would follow based on evaluation findings. Kalen stepped forward, her presence commanding attention, despite her small stature and civilian appearance. "Commander, if I may add some context to the evaluation findings." Her request for permission to address the assembled personnel suggested that additional revelations were forthcoming, information that would further illuminate the scope of her authority and the implications of the confrontation. Commander Hayes nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, please proceed." Kalen surveyed the silent mess hall, her gaze encompassing the dozens of personnel who had witnessed the confrontation and were now learning its true implications. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. My evaluation activities were authorized to assess operational readiness and behavioral patterns among special operations personnel. The specific focus included response to authority, decision-making under stress, and adherence to established protocols when confronting unfamiliar situations. The revelation that their entire confrontation had been designed as an evaluation exercise created new levels of understanding about both her authority and their failures. Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, if I may ask, was our entire interaction planned as part of your evaluation protocol?" The question reflected the team's growing awareness that they might have been deliberately tested, rather than simply encountering an unauthorized civilian who happened to possess unusual capabilities. Kalen's response was measured and professional. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, evaluation protocols require observing authentic behavioral responses to challenging situations. However, the specific nature and escalation of today's events exceeded anticipated parameters and provided more comprehensive assessment data than originally planned. The implication was that while some level of confrontation had been expected, Morrison's team had exceeded even worst-case scenarios in their failure to handle the situation appropriately." Commander Hayes stepped forward. "Ma'am, I believe facility personnel would benefit from understanding the full scope of your background and authority. This situation has clearly revealed gaps in our training regarding interaction with oversight personnel." The suggestion that Kalen should reveal her complete background created immediate tension throughout the mess hall. Personnel who had witnessed her combat demonstration and professional handling of the confrontation were clearly aware that significant revelations were forthcoming. Kalen considered the request carefully before responding. "Commander, in the interest of educational value and operational improvement, I'm authorized to provide limited background information relevant to today's evaluation activities." The permission to reveal previously classified information suggested that command-level decisions had been made to use this incident as a teaching moment for broader facility personnel. Captain Barnes addressed the assembled sailors and officers. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to receive information that will help you understand both the scope of today's evaluation and the serious implications of the behavior you witnessed." The introduction created expectant silence throughout the mess hall as personnel prepared to learn information that would explain the dramatic events they had observed. Kalen moved to a position where her voice would carry clearly throughout the room. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone shifting to one of unmistakable authority, "my name is Kalen Mitchell. I served 22 years in the United States Navy, retiring with the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer. My final assignment was as senior instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, where I was responsible for designing and implementing the current curriculum used in SEAL training programs." The revelation hit the assembled personnel like a physical blow. The small woman they had observed being dismissed and confronted by elite SEALs was not only a veteran herself, but had been instrumental in creating the very training programs that had forged their elite capabilities. Morrison's face went ashen as the implications became clear. He had not only assaulted a federal contractor, he had physically attacked someone who had been responsible for training the instructors who had trained him. Commander Hayes stepped forward, his expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching recognition. He studied Kalen's face with growing intensity, as if pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle were suddenly falling into place. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "before we proceed, I need to ask, are you Master Chief Kalen Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, former senior instructor at Naval Special Warfare Training Center?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Kalen's slight nod was all the confirmation Hayes needed. Commander Hayes took a step back, came to rigid attention, and rendered the sharpest, most respectful salute the mess hall had ever witnessed. His hand snapped to his brow with parade ground precision. His heels clicked together audibly, and his entire bearing transformed into that of a junior officer showing profound respect to a legendary senior. "Master Chief Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent mess hall, "it is an honor, ma'am. You saved my career during Hell Week, Class 237. I was ready to ring the bell on day 4 when you pulled me aside and told me that quitting was just another word for giving up on the teammates who were counting on me." The salute held for a full 5 seconds before Kalen returned it with equal precision, her own military bearing suddenly on full display despite her civilian clothes. Commander Hayes lowered his salute, but maintained his position of attention. "Ma'am, for the benefit of facility personnel, would you be willing to elaborate on your specific role in SEAL training development? These sailors need to understand exactly who they've been dealing with today." The request for additional detail now carried the weight of personal testimony from their commanding officer, confirming that significant revelations were forthcoming about Kalen's background and authority. Kalen nodded professionally. "Commander, during my tenure as senior instructor, I was responsible for developing psychological evaluation protocols, stress response training methodologies, and behavioral assessment criteria used in candidate selection and ongoing readiness evaluation. My work included designing the scenarios and evaluation criteria currently used to assess SEAL team operational readiness." The scope of her contributions to current SEAL training and evaluation protocols was becoming clear to facility personnel. She hadn't just been an instructor, she had been instrumental in creating the very standards by which they were currently being evaluated. Rodriguez managed to find his voice despite obvious shock. "Ma'am, does that mean you designed the evaluation protocols currently being used to assess our team's performance?" The question reflected growing understanding that their confrontation had been evaluated using standards that Kalen herself had developed, that they had essentially failed tests of their own creation. Kalen's smile was both professional and slightly ironic. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, the psychological evaluation protocols used in today's assessment were indeed based on methodologies I developed during my tenure as senior instructor. Your team's responses provided excellent examples of both positive and negative behavioral patterns used in current training scenarios. The revelation that they had become case studies in their own training programs added another layer of professional humiliation to the consequences they were facing." Williams raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what specific behavioral patterns did our team demonstrate that will be included in evaluation reports?" The question reflected both professional curiosity and personal concern about how their actions would be characterized in official documentation. Kalen considered her response carefully. "Petty Officer Williams, your team demonstrated several concerning patterns, including failure to recognize legitimate authority, escalation rather than de-escalation when confronting uncertain situations, inappropriate use of intimidation tactics against authorized personnel, and resort to physical force when verbal dominance was challenged. The systematic listing of their failures provided clinical assessment of behavior that had seemed justified and reasonable during the actual confrontation, but was clearly inappropriate when viewed through professional evaluation criteria." Captain Barnes addressed Morrison directly. "Petty Officer Morrison, you now understand that your physical contact with Master Chief Mitchell constituted assault on a senior enlisted veteran who has contributed more to special operations training than most officers achieve in entire careers. The formal identification of Kalen's military rank and service record transformed Morrison's assault from inappropriate behavior toward a civilian contractor into an attack on a respected senior military professional." Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper when he managed to respond. "Sir, I had no knowledge of Master Chief Mitchell's background or service record. However, that doesn't excuse my behavior or justify my actions." The acknowledgement was appropriate, but came far too late to mitigate the consequences of his earlier decisions and actions. Commander Hayes turned to address the broader assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's events provide valuable lessons about assumptions, authority, and the importance of professional behavior regardless of circumstances. Master Chief Mitchell's evaluation will include recommendations for training improvements based on observed deficiencies. The promise of training improvements based on evaluation findings suggested that consequence would extend beyond individual personnel to include systematic changes in facility procedures and educational protocols. Professional assessment requires secure documentation. Military-grade tablets with encryption capabilities ensure classified evaluations remain protected during field operations, like Kalen's current mission." Kalen addressed Commander Hayes directly. "Commander, my evaluation activities at this facility are essentially complete. However, based on observed deficiencies, I will be recommending comprehensive review of authority recognition training and stress response protocols for all special operations personnel." The scope of her recommendations extended far beyond Morrison's team, to include facility-wide training improvements and procedural modifications based on systemic deficiencies she had observed. Master Chief Kellaway stepped forward. Ma'am, speaking for facility leadership, we appreciate your professional assessment and welcome recommendations for operational improvement. We clearly have training gaps that need immediate attention. The acknowledgement of training deficiencies by senior enlisted leadership provided official validation of Kalen's evaluation findings and authority to recommend corrective measures. Captain Barnes addressed the assembled personnel. Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, all facility personnel will participate in mandatory training regarding interaction with authorized oversight personnel and recognition of legitimate authority regardless of individual appearance or civilian status. The announcement of mandatory facility-wide training based on evaluation findings confirmed that consequences would extend throughout the command structure, rather than focusing solely on Morrison's team. Kalen gathered her portfolio and prepared to conclude her facility activities. Commander Hayes, Captain Barnes, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, I want to thank you for your cooperation with this evaluation exercise. The behavioral data collected will contribute significantly to operational readiness improvements throughout Naval Special Warfare Command. The scope of her evaluation authority was becoming clear to facility personnel. This had not been isolated assessment of local performance, but systematic data collection for command-wide improvements in training and operational procedures. Rodriguez approached Kalen with obvious respect and humility. Ma'am, on behalf of our team, I want to apologize for our failure to recognize your authority and experience. We clearly have significant learning to do regarding professional behavior and operational protocols. The apology was comprehensive and appropriate, acknowledging both personal and professional failures that had been revealed through the evaluation process. Kalen's response was gracious but professional. Petty Officer Rodriguez, authentic learning often requires challenging experiences that reveal areas needing improvement. Your team's responses today will contribute to training improvements that benefit all special operations personnel. The reframing of their failures as learning opportunities provided some measure of dignity while maintaining accountability for inappropriate behavior and poor judgment. Williams and Murphy joined Rodriguez in approaching Kalen. Ma'am, Williams said, his voice reflecting genuine contrition, we hope that our failures today will indeed contribute to improvements that prevent other teams from making similar mistakes. The acknowledgement that their behavior represented systemic rather than individual failures suggested understanding of the broader implications of evaluation findings. Morrison finally approached the group, his body language reflecting complete humiliation and professional devastation. Master Chief Mitchell, he said, his voice barely audible, I want to apologize not just for my behavior today, but for failing to live up to the standards you helped establish for special operations personnel. The apology was personal and comprehensive, acknowledging both immediate failures and broader disappointment of professional expectations. Kalen's response was measured and professional. Petty Officer Morrison, military service provides opportunities for growth and learning throughout our careers. Today's experience can contribute to your development as a leader and professional warrior if you choose to learn from it rather than simply regret it. The offer of redemption through learning provided Morrison with a path forward, despite the serious consequences he would undoubtedly face for his behavior. Commander Hayes addressed Morrison's team directly. Gentlemen, you will report to my office at 1500 hours for comprehensive review of today's events and discussion of corrective measures. Your operational status is suspended, pending completion of mandatory training and behavioral assessment. The announcement of suspended operational status confirmed that consequences would be immediate and significant, affecting their mission assignments and professional responsibilities. Captain Barnes added his own directive. Additionally, all 4 team members will participate in comprehensive training regarding authority recognition, stress management, and appropriate interaction with oversight personnel before returning to operational duties. The requirement for additional training before operational reinstatement confirmed that their failures had been judged sufficiently serious to require systematic corrective education. Kalen prepared to make her final departure from the facility, her evaluation mission essentially completed and her findings documented for command review and action. Master Chief Kellaway approached her one final time. Ma'am, he said respectfully, will there be follow-up evaluation activities to assess the effectiveness of corrective measures implemented based on your findings? The question reflected practical concern about ongoing oversight and accountability for implementing evaluation recommendations. Kalen's response was professionally non-committal. Master Chief, follow-up evaluation activities are determined by command authority based on implementation progress and operational requirements. Facilities that demonstrate effective corrective action typically require less intensive oversight than those showing continued deficiencies. The implication was clear that future oversight would depend on their success in addressing identified problems and implementing recommended improvements. As Kalen moved toward the exit for her final departure, Commander Hayes made one additional announcement to facility personnel. Ladies and gentlemen, today's events demonstrate the importance of maintaining professional standards and appropriate behavior regardless of circumstances. Master Chief Mitchell's evaluation has provided valuable learning opportunities that will improve our operational effectiveness and professional development. The characterization of the confrontation as a learning opportunity rather than simply disciplinary failure provided some measure of positive framing for an otherwise professionally devastating experience. Kalen paused at the exit and turned to address the assembled personnel one final time. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent mess hall, "Special Operations personnel represent the finest traditions of military service. Today's experiences provide opportunities to recommit to those traditions and standards that make you truly elite warriors." The final message emphasized redemption and professional growth rather than simply focusing on failures and consequences, providing positive direction for moving forward from the evaluation experience. Next week's story features a janitor who stunned an entire Army base. Subscribe to never miss these incredible reveals. As Kalen departed the facility, her portfolio containing evaluation data that would reshape training protocols and operational procedures, the remaining personnel began to process the full implications of what they had witnessed and learned. Morrison's team faced immediate consequences, including suspended operational status, mandatory training, and formal disciplinary action. But beyond individual accountability, the entire facility would implement systematic improvements based on evaluation findings. Master Chief Kellaway began developing training protocols to address authority recognition deficiencies. Commander Hayes initiated review of unit procedures for interacting with oversight personnel. Captain Barnes prepared reports for higher command explaining evaluation findings and corrective measures. The confrontation that had begun with casual disrespect had revealed systematic deficiencies requiring comprehensive corrective action at multiple levels of command responsibility. But it had also demonstrated the continuing influence of senior professionals like Kalen Mitchell, whose contributions to special operations training extended far beyond their active service careers. 3 weeks later, Ryan Morrison sat in civilian clothes on a bench outside Naval Special Warfare Command, staring at the facility where his career had ended. The consequences of confronting Kalen Mitchell had exceeded his worst expectations: court-martial conviction for assault on a federal contractor, dishonorable discharge, loss of security clearance, and forfeiture of veteran benefits. Most devastating was learning the full scope of Master Chief Mitchell's contributions to special operations training. Every standard he'd failed, every protocol he'd violated had been established by the woman he had dismissed and assaulted. Morrison noticed a familiar figure approaching. Kalen Mitchell, carrying the same leather portfolio, walked with professional confidence. She altered her path toward him. Morrison stood respectfully. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for the letter you sent to my court-martial proceedings. Your recommendation for rehabilitation probably prevented harsher consequences." Kalen had submitted a letter acknowledging his potential for growth despite his unacceptable behavior. "Ryan," she said, using his first name, "military service teaches us mistakes have consequences, but they also provide opportunities for growth. Your actions were unacceptable, but they don't define your potential for future contribution. Ma'am, I've spent 3 weeks learning about your service record. I realize I didn't just assault a contractor that day. I attacked everything I stood for as a professional warrior." Ryan, special operations training forges warriors capable of difficult decisions under stress, but requires maintaining professional standards regardless of circumstances. That day, you forgot both your training and principles. Morrison nodded. "I've enrolled in anger management counseling and conflict resolution training. I'm pursuing civilian education in organizational leadership. I'm trying to learn from this experience rather than just regret it. Kaylin smiled slightly. That's exactly the response that demonstrates real potential for growth. Your willingness to take responsibility shows the character military training was supposed to develop. Ma'am, do you think someone who's failed as badly as I did can ever again contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves? Ryan, failure is often the beginning of real learning rather than the end of useful contribution. Your experience provides understanding that could help prevent similar failures in others. That's a form of service itself. As Kaylin departed, Morrison remained processing their conversation. The consequences would remain permanent, but redemption remained possible. Kaylin's phone vibrated with an encrypted message. Phoenix, we have a situation. 3 SEAL teams have failed readiness evaluations this month. Command wants comprehensive assessment. Report to NAVSPEC WAR Command for expanded evaluation authority. We may be looking at systematic program deficiencies requiring complete curriculum overhaul. Another message arrived. Admiral Richardson wants personal briefing. Presidential briefing scheduled next week regarding special operations readiness concerns. Your recommendations may influence national security policy and defense budget allocations. What had begun as routine facility assessment had evolved into comprehensive review of America's most elite military capabilities. The quiet woman with silver hair and a clipboard was about to reshape the future of American special operations training standards. The evaluation was far from over. It was just beginning.
The stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel, and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.